All right, I think I'm live. And of course I got to grab a drink real fast. All right, here we are. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It's the it's the week after spring break. We've returned from spring break, and we are here in week 12 of the semester. This is the announcements page for my anatomy and physiology class, BIO201, the spring of 2024. This is primarily focused for my online course, but also for my in-person classes that would like some extra, would need some of that attention or announcements there. So let's take a look at what we have planned for us here in the schedule in the next couple of weeks. So as you can see here, let's start with week 11. That was the week we just finished prior to the break. And so in week 11, we talked about primarily the big focus here was chapter 9. We talked about the joints, articulations, and body movements. Again, body movements plays a big role in here. We'll have to identify the different motions of the body that occur at the different joints. But I'll give you a review of the chapters and what to focus on here a little bit later. The next couple of weeks, we'll focus here on muscles themselves, chapter 10, muscle tissue, and chapter 11, the muscular system, where we look at the specific muscles of the body. So, just as a preview for what's coming ahead, you'll see that in this next couple of weeks, we'll be looking at finishing up on the muscular system, and then our final section will include the nervous system. So you can see here chapters 12, 13, and 14 include the nervous system, the anatomy of the nervous system, and the somatic nervous system. So one of the more complex systems in the human body will be discovered here in the last 3 weeks of the semester. So I encourage you guys to look forward to that. So as we get ready for the last bit here, and then your final exam won't be comprehensive. It'll just focus on the nervous system, and it'll be taken during the final. So you can see here as we start to focus on the last bit of the last 5 weeks of the semester here. I encourage you to keep working hard as you have all semester. Last 5 weeks here, the last third of the semester, right? We've got 2/3 of the way out of the way, the first 2/3 out of the way, and now we roll into the last 5 weeks of the semester here. Excuse me. All right. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at what we've talked about here so far in the last couple of the last couple of weeks, particularly as it related to the week before we left for the break here. Chapter 9 specifically focused on a few types of things here. You can see here the functional classification of joints. So the functional classification of joints refers to the how much movement occurs in any given joint, how much movement is available. The structural classification refers to what holds those joints together. And then we really focused on a lot of those different types of synovial joints. So synovial joints really takes the main stage here shortly after we talk about the different types of joints. The synovial joints are primarily the biggest ones that we'll focus on. So again, the functional classification, how much movement there is. So there are diarthroses. Those are ones that are freely movable. There are amphiarthroses. Those are ones that have a little bit of movement. And then there are synarthrosis, right? These are the joints that have no movement at all, like those of the sutures of the skull. The structural classification relates to what holds them together. So there's fibrous joints. Remember, like the sutures of the skull, they're held together by a fiber. The commonality here is that there is a ligament. There's fibrous joints. There are cartilaginous joints, and then there are synovial joints. And then specifically, as it comes to those different types of synovial joints, there's 6 types of synovial joints, or maybe there's 6 shapes they often come in. When I refer to that, I'm talking about specifically like the pivot joint, the saddle joint. Let's see if I can't pull that up here for you briefly as I. Right, so we've got fibrous joints. Fibrous joints are like sutures, syndesmosis, and gymphosis. There is also the types of joints that we mentioned that are cartilaginous joints. And they look like this, right? Cartilaginous joints between the syndesmosis, excuse me, a symphysis and a synchondrosis. And then finally, the 6 types of synovial joints, right? Like, what are their shapes of those synovial joints? Then finally, the last part here is the movements of the body. So, big part here, movements of the body. And we'll take that into the practical, where we'll identify all the different motions that occur at any given joint. So there we have the chapter 9, right? Joints, articulations, and movement, particularly the body movements. What is the shoulder doing? What is the hip doing? What is the knee doing? And so that's a big focus here as it relates to the chapter 9. When we get to chapter 10, we're talking about muscle tissue. So when we talk about that, there's 3 different types of muscle tissue. There is cardiac muscle. Let's jump to that. Let's jump to that one there. So there's 3 types of muscle tissue: cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and skeletal muscle, right? So the big topic here is the differences. Can you be able to tell the differences on a histological slide between these? And what are the characteristic differences between these 2 types of tissue, cardiac, smooth muscle tissue, and skeletal? Where are their locations? What is their function? One is which ones are voluntary, which ones are involuntary? What is the shape like? One of these has multiple nuclei. One of them has just one. But after we talk about cardiac, smooth, and skeletal muscle tissue, really, skeletal muscles take front stage. So we talk about the functions of skeletal muscles, the gross and microscopic structure of muscles, and then the steps of a skeletal muscle contraction. So primarily that's broken up into 3 things: the events at the neuromuscular junction, the excitation, contraction, coupling, and then finally the last stage here is what's known as the cross bridge cycling. And so I give you those three main ideas as it relates to the skeletal muscle contraction for you guys to kind of review that And so when you do review that, you can do that in a number of different ways. I've got the lectures recorded, but also I encourage you to investigate some YouTube videos here that give us some really good context as to what happens during these skeletal muscle contractions. So the first thing is the events at the neuromuscular junction. And so that looks it looks like this here, right? So I'm going to throw up a video here. And this is a video. It's a muscle contraction part 1. It's tabled right there. The events at the neuromuscular junction. This is clearly from YouTube, and it's giving us a example of what happens at the first stage of a muscle contraction, right? So there's a motor neuron. Every muscle is innervated by a nerve that is called the motor neuron. The motor neuron will release the neurotransmitter that will always be acetylcholine. Now, skeletal muscle is the cell, right? So a skeletal muscle fiber is the cell. It's long, cylindrical in shape, and is made up of long strands of proteins. Now, the site where the motor neuron meets the skeletal muscle is referred to as the neuromuscular junction. That is specifically the neuromuscular junction. So the events that occur at the neuromuscular junction is the first steps of a skeletal muscle contraction. So you've got the axon terminals of a motor neuron and the motor end plate of the sarcolemma, the region of the cell membrane. And so the first step is an action potential is going to travel down the axon of the neuron, and it's going to stimulate the release of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So the next step here that occurs is that the calcium channels will be stimulated that are going to allow for the acetylcholine to be released via synaptic vesicles. See, so we have this acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter that's going to be released via exocytosis. It's going to bind to the receptors that are on the muscle. It's going to allow sodium to rush in. So we can see that these receptors here have a ability to open and allow ions in and out. So when they open, you're going to see that open here instead of the next stage here. That's going to allow sodium to rush in. It's going to allow potassium to rush out. And ultimately, that's going to cause depolarization. It's going to cause a electrical charge to run across the entire cell membrane. So those are primarily the steps that happen at the events of the neuromuscular junction. The next step there is going to include the propagation of an action potential. So this action potential will travel across. This action potential will then cross across the entire muscle cell, and it will cause calcium to be released. So in the next context here, we're looking at the excitation contraction coupling, and it starts very similarly. So if we take a look here at the excitation contraction coupling, and again, I'll start here from the top. And again, the same context starts where a nerve or a neuron will stimulate the cell membrane, the sarcolemma. And so in this context, now in our previous video, what we saw was that this cell, this action potential is traveling across the cell membrane, and we can even draw it like this way as well. But now what's going to happen is it's going to find its way into the cell by way of T tubules. So these structures here that I'm identifying pointing into the cell are T tubules. There's another structure referred to as the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That's right here, this purple structure here, the SR, houses calcium ions. Calcium is going to be released to cause, that's going to stimulate the cause of a muscle contraction. So we'll clear that off just to, actually, let's let it play a little bit, and then I'll clear it. Again, you could see it traveling across, but into as well. And it's going to cause this to release calcium. Calcium's going to bind to the structures that cause a muscle contraction to occur. So then we have there, we're going to take a look here at our D tubules. There is on the, see if I can't write that there. You can see that here's the T tubule right here. And then there's the SR on the other side there. So the SR. And what's going to happen is you're going to have this action potential travel down the T tubule. It's going to stimulate the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it's going to cause calcium to be released. Calcium release ions, right? Then the last part here, let me just hit it up while we're here, is the cross bridge cycle. We'll kind of demonstrate that here in our last video. But that is ultimately where we have the proteins, the thick and thin filaments that are sliding amongst each other. We'll take a look here in this short video, and then we'll wrap up our review by talking about chapter 11. As we take a look here, we can see in the idea here behind the last phase of of the muscle contraction, the cross bridge cycling. So first we should introduce the sarcomere. That's the functional unit of a muscle contraction. It consists of alternating thick and thin filaments. So you can see here as we start to zoom in, we've got the alternating thin, thick, thin, thick filaments. So the thick filaments primarily in the middle, thin myofilaments on the outside sliding across each other here. And so what happens is calcium is going to actually bind. So what we have is, let's see here. So the first one we have is, this is the thin filament. This is referred to as actin. You've got the thick filament here. That's this one. That's myosin, the thick filament. There's myosin. And so myosin has a thick club-like head. It's responsible for pulling and attaching the thin filament, so it pulls it towards it. But unfortunately, the binding sites are blocked. So you can see this long thread-like protein that is identified here. It is known as tropomyosin. Oh, let me see if I can't play that for us. It's known as tropomyosin. So you can see calcium binding to this troponin. So there's troponin there. That's a three protein complex. But it causes ultimately tropomyosin to move away from the myosin binding site, allowing myosin to bind with actin. And so this is the cross bridge cycle. The myosin head binding with the actin and going through three different or four different steps, right? You can see ATB binding to the myosin head, detaches, toxic. Once it attaches, here we have the cross bridge cycle. So here's the breakdown. The first step, there's cross bridge formation. There's where the attachment occurs. Step number 2 is referred to as the power stroke. So the power stroke is when the myosin head pulls it towards the midline, towards the middle. And then the third step is the cross bridge detachment, where ATP will bind to the myosin head. It will detach and recock it. Reactivation of the myosin head. So that reattachment site. So this happens continually as long as there's binding sites on the actin exposed because of calcium in the sarcoplasm, and as long as there's energy, this can occur as long as necessary. And so those are that is chapter 10, the muscle tissue, events of the steps of a skeletal muscle contraction is going to be a big one as it relates to that. And then finally, I'll wrap up this announcements here by going over the muscular system, chapter 11. Okay, and so that one is basically the muscular system, and so we should be able to look at the muscle master list that's up there on your canvas. You should be able to identify muscles based on their picture or a picture of them. So if I give you a picture of a muscle, whether it's a cadaver picture or a image that's a cartoon picture, you should be able to identify those muscles. You should be able to identify the origin of the muscle. Where does the muscle start, also referred to sometimes as the proximal attachment point? The insertion, which is often referred to as the distal attachment site, and then the action of the muscle, right? So this is that body movement that we're talking about. An example here might be, let me just pull it up right here. These are ones that are on your slides here. If I jump to chapter 11 slides, identify a muscle that's fairly commonly used here, like your biceps. Where's your biceps? Pretty common one that you should be asked to, that you should know. Let's take a look here. Bang, right there. Bicep. There it is. The biceps brachii muscle. You can see it right there on the right side of your screen. There's the muscle itself. It has two origination points. Let me zoom in and show you those origination points. One here is the coracoid process. There's the coracoid process right there. The other one is the supraglenoid tubercle. They're both located on the scapula here. So you can see that this is the scapula being identified. Both of these origination sites are located on the scapula. So you can see there the short head attaches to the coracoid process of the scapula, that is the supraglenoid tubercle, again, of the scapula, and then the insertion all the way down into the radius, which is the radial tuberosity, right? So it attaches right into the radial tuberosity of the radius. Zoom in right there. There it is right there. So on the medial part, where the thumb side, you have the radius. On the pinky side, on the inside, is the ulna. So let me just kind of, this is, you've got, this side is lateral. And so there's the radius. The medial side is right here. And so the ulna is on the medial side. You can see there that the action of this muscle as well includes elbow flexion, forearm supination. So again, you'll see that there is a master muscle list. Take a look at that master muscle list, be able to identify those muscles by picture. If I give you a picture of it, its origin, where does it start? Where does it insert? And ultimately, what is its action here? So that kind of wraps up our announcements here. I've been there about a half hour, so that'll wrap up our announcements here for the day, the week here, week 12. As we wrap up into the last 5 weeks of the semester, I encourage you guys to keep doing the hard work that you have been doing. You guys are doing great. I know it's not easy, but you guys are moving on. You're doing great as you have. I look forward always to your responses, either by homework, email, or exams. And so I encourage you guys to keep working hard as you have, focusing on chapters 9, 10, and 11 here in this next 2 weeks. Thank you again for your time. I wish you guys the best, and I look forward to your responses.